I still can't forget what happened on our field trip. An old Civil War battlefield turned museum. The chaperones hyped it up as a living history experience, but the vibe was more graveyard than field trip. The site loomed ahead, its weathered sign swinging in the wind. Blackwood Preserve, history lives here. I stepped off the bus and onto brittle grass. The air was colder than it should have been for spring. Behind me, my classmates laughed and took selfies, but the hollow quiet of the place weighed on me. An unshakable feeling settled in my gut, a warning I couldn't explain. Our guide, a man with sunken eyes and a voice like rusted hinges, led us to a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches clawing at the overcast sky. This was the site of the infamous Blackwood Massacre, he began, voice heavy with practiced drama. A regiment of soldiers ambushed in the dead of night, their screams lost to history. His words hung in the air as I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me, almost like a heartbeat pulsing through the soil. I glanced down but saw only grass, yet the unease remained. We split into groups to explore. My team headed toward the preserved barracks. The old structure sagged under the weight of centuries, its warped wood smelling of mildew and rot. As we stepped inside, a chill swept over me. I looked around. The air shimmered, almost like heat waves, but it was freezing. In a flash, the room transformed. Faded walls straightened, candles flickered to life, and soldiers in ragged uniforms bustled around me. Their faces were pale, their movements hurried and tense. Then, just as suddenly, the vision dissolved, leaving me in the dim, decaying barracks. My friends didn't notice a thing. I shook it off and followed the group outside. The tour continued through the old infirmary, a barn converted to tend to the wounded. Inside, I caught the metallic tang of blood. The faint groans of agony rose in the distance, growing louder until they filled my head. I turned, and for a split second, the space was crowded with ghostly figures. Doctors in blood-soaked aprons, soldiers clutching severed limbs, their eyes wide in silent pleas. One of them turned to me, his translucent hand outstretched. "Help us," his lips seemed to say before he vanished. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. A classmate asked if I was okay, but I nodded, not trusting my voice. As we left the infirmary, I noticed someone missing. Sarah, the girl who'd been snapping pictures earlier, was gone. Probably wandered off, someone joked, but I wasn't laughing. I scanned the crowd, unease knotting in my stomach. No one seemed to care. Then I saw it. A figure in a tattered dress standing at the edge of the woods. "Sarah?" I called her name, but she turned and disappeared into the trees. Against my better judgment, I followed. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sound, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Shadows shifted between the trees, and I thought I saw glimpses of Sarah ahead. But every time I got closer, she moved deeper into the woods. Finally, I stepped into a clearing. A ring of stones marked an ancient fire pit in the center, charred wood still smoldering faintly. Around the circle stood ghostly figures, their translucent forms flickering like dying flames. My breath caught as I realized they were students, classmates who had vanished earlier. Before I could run, the air shimmered again and I was somewhere else. A battlefield stretched before me, chaos erupting all around. Soldiers charged, cannon fire roared, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled my lungs. In the middle of the carnage stood a man in a dark uniform, his face obscured by shadows. He turned slowly, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt them bore into me. He raised a hand, and everything froze, the soldiers, the cannon fire, even the air itself. "You shouldn't be here," his voice echoed in my head, low and chilling. The scene dissolved, and I was back in the clearing, gasping for air. The ghostly students turned to me, their faces hollow and lifeless. One stepped forward. It was Sarah, but not. Her eyes glowed faintly, her mouth moving in silent warning. The ground beneath me rumbled, and the fire pit burst into flames, illuminating carvings in the stones, symbols of binding and sacrifice. The ghostly figures circled closer, their mouths stretching into unnatural grins. I tried to back away, but the shadows of the trees stretched and wrapped around my legs, holding me in place. The man in the dark uniform appeared again, this time stepping from the woods. His presence was overwhelming. the air around him heavy with menace. "You were brought here for a reason," he said without speaking, his voice rumbling in my mind. "Fresh blood to break the curse." The ghostly students began to chant, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. The flames grew higher, the symbols glowing brighter. I struggled, but the shadows held tight, dragging me toward the fire. Desperate, I reached for a stone, hoping to break the symbols. My hand passed through it like smoke. The man laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Your soul belongs to Blackwood now," he said, stepping closer. The shadows wrapped tighter, pulling me into the flames. The last thing I saw was Sarah's ghostly face, a single tear rolling down her cheek as she mouthed, "I'm sorry." I woke up on the bus, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The other students were chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. I turned to Sarah, who sat beside me, scrolling through her phone. "That was weird," I mumbled, but she didn't respond. I touched her arm. It was cold, too cold. She turned slowly, her eyes glowing faintly. "Welcome back," she whispered, her voice overlapping with a dozen others. The bus rolled away. The field trip to Blackwood Preserve nothing more than a memory, or a nightmare. But as we passed the edge of the woods, I saw them, the ghostly figures watching, waiting for the next group of fresh souls.